Everyone should be allowed to like and love what they see as art. Because really, there's nothing, what is art? It's very difficult to define. What art is, it's a reflection of our society in the purest form that can be. Anything else can really be manipulated, but an artist really is a prophet. An artist is someone who was a journalist before they were a journalist. And so they were able to transcribe the world as they saw it. They had a particular vision of it. And there's so many artists, just there are many different journalists and many different tastes and many different opinions. And they're able to show people things that maybe an image is not able to do it, because they're able to go, as Picasso did, directly into the essence. In the studio, everyone was at the same level. So you would have people like Matisse, Miro, Braque, Chagall, Cocteau, all the modern masters of the time. And even when we opened the studio in New York, you would have people like Lichtenstein, Oldenburg, Rauschenberg, all these artists that would come in. And it was a place that was wonderful for creativity because they were able to mix, exchange ideas. Miro and Picasso were very close friends. But Picasso and Chagall were not. And I think it's also reflected in the artwork. For example, Chagall is an artist that is more of a poet, someone that works more from the heart. That Picasso is more visceral. He's more of a painter of the truth, and therefore it's really a different philosophy. And right there, it was not meant to be really a close friendship with Chagall, that with Miro being more of a serialist and being more an intellectual, it fit better with Picasso. It's very important for people to understand that there was a point in time where there was so much creativity in Europe up until the sort of early 60s, and in the United States, especially from the 60s on. And that to actually collect works that were handmade, that were really intensive in the work that was provided not only by the artist, but in the collaboration with the master printer, as opposed to something that may be more mechanical nowadays, is really, again, a testament to the hard work that people put in and all the heart and passion that they put in to create these works. And that's what makes them so special. So I think that, again, this is really something that is very exciting for us. I hope that it will maybe start a new era in creation, publishing. I hope that younger artists will want to create works like this more often, that they will be interested in working with artisans, that they will be interested in spending more time with their graphic works. Well, we started in 1852. My great-great-grandfather was a wallpaper printer and commercial printer, and this is how we started into the business. And it's not until the 1920s when my grandfather started printing the lithographic posters for all the national museums in France that a lot of the artists actually started coming to the studio, and my grandfather noticed that and started inviting artists to create original works themselves on the stones. So the Moorlot collection really was the collection of the Moorlot studio. As we were printing for artists, whether we were publishers or whether we were printing for museums, we would keep printer's proofs. So we had a very large warehouse, and when a museum orders 100 or 150 images, as a printer, you have the right to several proofs. That is part of the agreement. After the printing of the edition, put them in a warehouse. And they were kept in the warehouse for almost 70 years until the studio closed in 1999. And I, being the steward of the family collection, started managing this fund. And so we worked with museums, we worked with foundations, we loan a lot of the archives, images of the artists, letters, and we also have several proofs that became available for sale. And that is how these works have come to be on the market. A lithograph comes from the Greek lithos and the German graph, which is graphic. And the artist will work with a greasy substance and draw directly on the stone. It's a limestone that usually comes from Bavaria, but there are a few here. Currier and Ives, for example, was a very famous lithographer in the United States, just as we were in France. And it was technologically the best way to create color prints, because it's based on the repulsion of water and grease. So as the artist draws directly with that greasy substance, either as a crayon or if it's melted like a wash, like an ink, this greasy substance will later retain the printing inks onto the stone. And therefore, you can apply any kind of ink on it, whatever color, and one by one you start building up. So for every color, every different color, you have a different stone. It just has to register perfectly, and that's when the master printer comes and complements what the artist does. It's a very difficult manual process, but for a very long time it was the only way to really create color prints. Once they are created, once the lithograph, the edition is created, it's destroyed, so you cannot recreate a new one, and that's why they're so valuable. Now we have a few stones that have survived. We have about 15 Matisse stones that we loan to museums and that are spoken for because we have promised, for example, the Matisse family, that we would donate them to the Matisse museums in Nice or the Matisse Museum in Cateau-Cambrésis in France. Well, the great thing about growing up in Paris is, in our neighborhood, everything is pretty close. So my school was only a few hundred yards away from the studio. And when I would come out of school, I would go to the Morlot studio and do my homework. And I got to meet a lot of artists there. I got to meet Chagall, I got to meet Moreau when they were working on the stones. And I would spend a lot of time with the master printers, and this is where I learned to print myself lithography and really developed a passion for it. And to this day, I remember the smell of the ink, feeling the paper, the wooden desks that had been worn after years and years of paper going over it. It was quite an amazing experience, and really I'll always cherish that. It was a large place. The last studio in Paris was about almost 40,000 square feet. It's on different floors. You have an area where the artists have little booths and they're able to work in peace and quiet. But next to them you have small presses, hand presses, where they're working with a master printer to get exactly the final product that they want. Once that final image is produced, it's taken downstairs to a slightly larger press. Now those presses are also from the late 1800s, and they would be pulled at a little bit of a faster pace. But let's say if you have an edition of 50, 75, or 100, it would still take a good hour and a half, 2 hours to go through one color. A lot of curators and directors and even collectors are able to show me things that I may have missed. The other day I was looking at images of Georges Braque's studio that no one had ever seen and that were in our archives. And one of the researchers at the Museum of Modern Art pointed out that in the corner of the room were these large metal rods, and there was a painting in the forward. Now what I'd never realized, nor anyone else that had seen the images, is that those metal rods were used to create the painting. And so if you have the right researcher, you can find something out all the time. And that really takes you back into the creative process of the artist. It's almost as if you have a window into history and you get transported back in there. And this is what all these images are. They really are little windows into history, and they're vintage. And once they're gone, they're gone. They won't be around anymore, and it would be so prohibitive to recreate them in lithography in that particular medium, because nowadays it's almost impossible to do it. It would just be too costly. It's very interesting because quite often in lithography, it's impossible to say which one was really number one. Because when you create the edition, if there's several colors, what will happen is you have to bring once the first color is printed on 100 different images, you have to bring the paper back on top of the press. So you actually have to cut the edition as you bring it back up. Therefore, it's like shuffling cards. So when people say that number 1 is more valuable than number 37, it's actually completely wrong, because we don't know for sure which one was number 1. However, what you may have is proofs, because proofs that are created on a different press and that were worked on by the artists originally may have a richer color on it. And so that's a little bit different, because you're talking about images that were really, the artist was intimately involved, not just with the stone or the matrix, but in changing things and sometimes annotating things. So that gives them a little bit of a different feel. But really, when it comes to the regular edition, there's absolutely no difference between number 1 and number 37. Basically, the difference between a lithographic poster and a sign-numbered edition is simply the amount of them and the fact that the artist has put a signature on it, as well as the paper. Quite often, they would pick a paper that was handmade, that was thicker, and that would receive the ink differently. Also, it was a little bit more expensive and higher quality paper. But basically, the medium that is being used and the technique is exactly the same. But what happened is that a lot of artists realized the power of presenting their work in posters, because that was the first time that the public, the general public, would see it on the streets of Paris. And so when Picasso realized that a lot of people that walked down the street had never seen one of his work, in museums, usually you would get a byline in the newspaper announcing a show coming up in a museum. But here he was able to speak directly to the people on the street. And suddenly it was the first time that someone saw what Picasso had done. So when he did, for example, the Colombe de la Paix, which is the peace dove, people that were walking the streets of Paris saw it for the first time. That was the first Picasso that they actually saw. And it was using advertising in the medium of advertising big posters, which had been started by Toulouse-Lautrec and Chéret in the late 19th century to advertise plays, to advertise cabarets. And here they were advertising museum shows or gallery shows in the windows of cafes, on the streets of cities. Even cities started commissioning artists to create beautiful tourism posters to advertise the city and the rest of the country. What he would do in his case is that he would rework the stone quite a bit. So he would work on several images at the same time for several weeks. He may go and revisit an image. He would actually take all his time, rework it, erase with another little stone to erase what he had done, or even sometimes scratch. He would, Picasso was someone that always innovated, and he reinvented things, and he used techniques that you were not supposed to use in lithography. He would use substances like gasoline or wax, which you're never supposed to use in lithography. And it was difficult sometimes for the master printers to keep up with him. So Picasso would work on maybe 15, 16 different images at the same time, and he could be working there for a couple weeks, 3 weeks. Quite often he would come and spend 4 months at a time in the studio and create maybe 20 or 25 different editions in that period of time. And so people remember him very fondly and quite generous, as a matter of fact. But the funny part is when there were other artists that were working there, quite often he would ask his studio to be locked up because he was afraid that other artists would steal his ideas. But the funny part is that a lot of the other artists also felt that he was going to steal some of their ideas. The fact that he constantly reinvents himself, that he's able to start as an amazing draftsman. I mean, Picasso can draw a dog, a horse, hands, which are the most difficult things to draw, a face, perfectly well as a draftsman, very realistic. And then, if you're able to do this, and you've earned your stripes, you're able to then come out of the usual ways, and you're able to really discover new meanings, new ways to communicate with people. So, for example, what Picasso very quickly starts doing with portraits is, instead of trying to transcribe exactly the subject, the character, he tries to get to the essence of the person who's sitting in front of him. Quite often, as a matter of fact, he would simply have them sit for a few hours and then they were free to go, and he would work from images, from photographs, to finish the portrait. Because really, truly, at the end of the day, it wasn't so much what the person looked like, but the way their personality was. And so very few little idiosyncrasies were enough to really describe the subject in his art. Well, usually when I give lectures in museum, I start with a picture of Picasso with my grandfather on the beach. And while in the image, it isn't me, on the image it's actually my father. And really I've spent almost 40 years of my life talking about it with people since I was a young man, and really discovering new facets of his work every time I look at it. Well, how do you price art? It's an art in itself. So art is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. At the end of the day, it depends on how rare, it depends on the quality of the colors, it depends on a lot of different things. For me, a little tear is only part of history. I was at a museum in, it was the Tate Liverpool actually, and they were doing a show of a Picasso and the peace movement. And in the museum, they had a proof of one of the Peace Congress that Picasso did, and I was providing them with another image. Mine was actually in better shape than the one that was in the museum. So I think that if it's good enough for museums, I think that people will enjoy that part of it, and I think that it shows the history of a piece. It shows where the piece has been, and as long as it's genuine and as long as you feel like you're transported at the time, personally, it does not bother me. I think it actually adds to the story of the piece. A lot of museums, for example, prefer to purchase proofs that are unsigned quite often from us because they know what the provenance is, and the provenance is very important. But as long as the image comes from the right provenance and that the artist created it, I prefer to annotate it. Quite often it's the estates actually that have asked me to do this, and we actually use a stamp with a special ink that is cannot be removed, so that it cannot be later on signed, or a fake signature cannot be applied to it. Provenance simply says that this print, this graphic work, came from a certain particular collection or particular place. So, for example, what very often people don't realize is that a certificate of authenticity can only be provided by the artist or by the artist's estate. In the case of Picasso and Matisse, they do not provide certificates of authenticity for prints because they don't have the structure necessary to do this, because they already have to deal with thousands of paintings and tens of thousands of drawings. So what we do and what we're able to do as the original printers for all these modern masters is to provide a certificate of provenance explaining that this particular piece came from our studio, that it was created at a particular time, and those are quite often accepted at Sotheby's or Christie's. The viewer has its own job, which is to really interpret what the artist has done. So this is what I do as a viewer or as a dealer, is that I look very much at what my job is, which is to look at the artwork, interpret it in my own way. Two people will not see a piece of art the same way, but either of our opinion is just as valuable. Well, there are artists that I love personally because I respond to them. For example, Fernand Léger, even though I did not know him and he passed away a long time before I was born, Fernand Léger to me is an amazing artist because his work is really about people. It's about workers. When he was in the United States of America and he worked on all these constructors building these amazing tall skyscrapers, or when he was working on all these workmen or these farmers in France, and you see the size of their hands and the heart and soul, and it's really about glorifying hardworking people. Miro was wonderful and like a child, surrealistic. Now, he was incredibly sweet to me, got me my first box of paint when I was 6 years old, which unfortunately got me into big trouble because I decided to repaint my grandmother's kitchen, and that didn't go over too well. But also, I'm quite happy and proud of the fact that one day while they were at lunch with my grandfather, I came back and not realizing that the stick figures were by Miro, I added a little cigarette to one of them, and everybody almost had a heart attack because, you know, they thought that I had messed, you know, a great piece of artwork. And when Miro came back from lunch, he looked at it and everyone told him how sorry they were, and he just added smoke to it. So I can say that I actually created something with Miro, but that's, you know.